They yanked her by the wrists, the force so harsh that it left marks before the hymn was even finished. The pastor paused mid-sentence. The choir stopped singing. Aunt McCrae, heavy with child, a child no one dared to claim as their own, was dragged down the steps of St. Elijah's Church as if she were a lesson to be taught. Someone in the crowd muttered that she was lying with one of them. She had let herself be touched by a savage. Her bonnet slipped off as she stumbled, revealing sweat-drenched curls and eyes that didn't beg for mercy. Not even when the sheriff stepped forward, his gaze between pity and disgust. "Anth," he said, quieter than the crowd deserved. "You shouldn't have come. Where else should I be?" She replied, her voice calm. "God made this child same as he made yours." A woman spat, another crossed herself, and the pastor remained silent, as still as sin. They had meant to humiliate her, to parade her through the town, shove her to the cabin at the outskirts, and tell her never to return. But they never got that far. Standing just beyond the fence, tall and unwavering in the heat, was a man no one had seen arrive. He wore no hat, no boots, just a faded red cloth tied at his shoulder, and his gaze was strong enough to halt a galloping charge. "Lakota," some whispered. "Ghost Walker," they called him. A name shared among children and drunkards alike. But he stepped forward now, deliberate and slow, and the crowd parted, not from respect but from fear. Anth lifted her head from the dirt, and their eyes met. She didn't plead. He didn't speak. He simply extended his hand. The crowd froze. The sheriff's hand reached for his weapon but didn't draw it. A bird called from the trees, the only sound in the tense silence. Then Anth pushed herself up, not with the help of the men who had dragged her, but on her own. She walked to the Lakota man and took his hand. No words were exchanged, just the heavy silence of a town realizing it couldn't break her. He turned with her, and together they walked away from the church, from the shame, down the stairs, and into the woods, into the unknown where silence held more truth than scripture. They walked in quiet for a long while. The forest swallowed the sounds of the church behind them until it was nothing more than a distant memory, softened by pine needles. Anth kept one hand on her belly, the other in his. His fingers were rough, warm, calloused from work, not war. They crossed a creek and climbed over a fallen tree. When the path narrowed into a clearing of ferns and shadows, he stopped. She braced herself against a stone and turned to face him. "Why?" she asked, breathless. "Why did you come?" He studied her for a long moment, then pointed to her stomach, then to the sky, and then back to her. Anth frowned. "You knew?" she asked. He didn't answer, just gazed steadily at her. "You knew him?" she asked again, her voice cracking slightly. "The father." Slowly he nodded. Not shamefully, not proudly, just truthfully. Her knees nearly gave out. She sat on the earth, stunned, unable to cry. "He's dead," she whispered. "They told me he was taken by soldiers near the border. That there was nothing left." The man lowered himself beside her, still silent. "I thought I'd lost everything," she murmured. "And now? You just show up, say nothing, and take my hand like it means something?" He pulled a pouch from his side, carefully unwrapping a worn piece of rawhide. Inside, there was a single carved figure, wooden, smooth with age. It was a woman with long hair, hands on her belly. He placed it beside her. "He carved this," she said softly, "for me, before he left." The tears came without warning. "I didn't even get to say goodbye." He reached forward, placing a single finger on her shoulder. Not to hush her, not to claim her pain, but simply to say, "I'm here." "What do I call you?" she asked quietly. "I can't just call you nothing." He reached into the dirt and drew a circle with a single straight line. She didn't understand what it meant, but somehow it felt like a name. "Walker?" she guessed. "Ghost." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood and offered his hand again. This time, she took it. Not in fear or desperation, but as a woman who had chosen to move forward, not for the town, not for the shame, but for her child, and now maybe for him too. He built the fire with a care she hadn't seen before, each branch placed with intention. Stones set in a perfect circle as though the flames needed boundaries to be trusted. Anth sat on a woven blanket, dyed with ochre and sky-blue thread, not made by white hands. The forest was still, but her mind was loud. "They won't stop," she said finally. "The town, the whispers, the sheriff. They'll come for me again." He looked at her, then at the fire, then reached into his pouch again, withdrawing another carving. This one smaller, shaped like a bird in mid-flight. He placed it beside the first figure, the one of the pregnant woman, and pointed to the space between them. "A child," she said, her eyes wide. "You knew about the baby before I did?" He nodded, silent as ever. His silence spoke volumes, leaving Anth to hug her knees tightly. "He told me stories," she whispered. "Your brother. About the land, the stars, how names aren't just labels, they're prayers." He didn't move. "Is that why you won't tell me yours?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because it's buried with him?" The man picked up a stick and traced patterns in the dirt again. This time he drew a symbol. A mountain next to a rising sun, 3 dots beneath it, and a bird. The image took shape slowly, like a song she almost remembered. "Was that your home?" she asked, her voice soft. Before the raids, he gave a single nod, and she understood he belonged to that place, too. The man looked at her then, not with kindness, but with something sharper, almost like a promise, and she understood it. "You didn't just come for me," she said, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. "You came for him. You want to take him back to your people?" she asked. He didn't answer, just let the fire crackle between them. His silence was enough. "I can't go back there," she murmured. "Not alone. Not as white. Not after everything they've done." He stood, walked to the edge of the firelight, and returned with a small hide bundle. Inside were herbs, feathers, and something that smelled like cedar and memory. He pressed it into her hand. "What is it?" she asked, but he spoke only one word, quiet as ash. "Permission." She didn't know what it meant yet, but it settled in her bones like the first time someone believed she was more than her shame. At dawn, they moved. He didn't say where they were going. He simply pointed toward the canyon, where the trees grew closer together, and the air tasted like stone. Anth followed without question, despite the ache in her feet and the weight of her unborn child pulling her down. The silence between them had shifted. It wasn't empty anymore, but filled with decisions still to be made. She often thought of the town, wondering if they were looking for her, wondering if someone would come with ropes and laws and fire in their hands. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a stream. That's when she saw them, 3 riders moving slowly, scanning the brush like wolves on a trail. One of them wore a black coat. She recognized him immediately. Sheriff Markham. Her breath caught in her throat. "They're looking for me," she whispered. The Lakota man crouched low, his eyes narrowed. He pointed toward a narrow trail that veered away from the stream and deeper into the hills. She hesitated. "You could leave me here," she said. "You've done enough. This isn't your fight." But he didn't move. He just pressed his hand gently against her back and started walking. She followed. Behind them, the sound of hooves echoed, drifting up the canyon walls like thunder, trying not to wake the mountain. They didn't stop until nightfall, finding shelter in a rock overhang. The walls of the shelter were covered with ancient charcoal drawings, forgotten prayers clinging to the stone. Anth traced one of the spirals with her finger, finding a handprint within it. "What does this mean?" she asked him. He watched her, then touched his chest, then hers, and finally the stone. "We carry them," she whispered, "even when we don't remember." He didn't answer, but she saw something in his eyes, something carved in him long before she arrived. She thought of the riders, the rope, the shame, and the weight. And then she thought of the firelight, the figures he carved, and the bundle he gave her, permission. "I want to give him your name," she said softly. "If you'll let me." His gaze sharpened. "Not for ownership, not for claiming," she hurried to add. "Just so he remembers who stood for him." He nodded once, and then drew the spiral again, this time inside a circle. "A whole complete name," he said. The words unspoken but understood, drawn in the dirt between them. They waited at the bottom of a ravine, the sound of hooves growing louder. This time there were 4 men, 2 on horseback, 2 on foot. No hoods, no disguises, just law stitched into their vests and judgment in their eyes. The sheriff raised a hand. "Anth," he called, "we won't hurt you. Just come down." She froze in place mid-step. The Lakota man stopped beside her. He said nothing, but she could feel the stillness in him harden. "I'm not going back," she called out. "You lost that right when you turned God into a weapon." The sheriff's face flickered, surprise, maybe pain. "You're carrying a child that doesn't belong in that town," he said, his voice softer. "That child belongs where he's loved," she said, "and where he's not hunted." One of the deputies stepped forward, hand on his rifle. "We've got orders," he said. "You've got fear," she replied, "and you want to make it." She turned away from them, not in their direction, but into the trees. The Lakota man moved with her, his hand resting on the pouch at his side, his steps quiet and assured. The first shot rang out just as she neared the bend, striking the rock beside her head and sending shards flying. The second shot came quickly, but it missed her and instead hit the man beside her in the shoulder. He didn't fall, only staggered, his teeth clenched and his hand pressing into the wound as if pain were something he had learned to live with. She screamed, not because of the blood, but because she knew they had finally been found. The sheriff's shout came from below, filled with panic or confusion, but she couldn't make out the words. She pulled the man toward a thicket, dragging him with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Behind them, the sound of hooves thundering like a storm followed. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please just hold on." He blinked at her, bleeding but silent, his gaze steady. Reaching into his pouch again, he pulled out a single feather, dark and weathered at the tips, and pressed it into her palm. "For him?" she asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and urgency. He nodded. She held the feather against her chest. "Then you're not dying here, not like this." She tore a strip from her skirt and used it to bind the wound, forcing him to lean against her as they continued to move. She could hear the sheriff no longer firing his gun, perhaps seeing something in them, perhaps fearing something greater than just the scandal of the moment. A woman walking uphill with blood on her hands and a child in her belly, carrying a man who would not die like this. By dusk, they had reached a hollowed cedar grove, far enough from the canyon that the wind no longer carried their names. The man's breath had become shallow, and though she had stopped the bleeding, his skin had turned pale under the fading light. Anth, with trembling hands, built a fire, snapping branches with her boot heel and murmuring to the baby growing inside her as though her words could hold everything together. "He's going to live," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You hear me? You need to remember him. You need to carry what they tried to burn." Once the flames caught, she boiled water with herbs from his pouch, the sharp, bitter smell of iron and root filling the air as she dabbed his forehead with the mixture. "I don't even know your name," she said softly, "but you saved mine." His eyes flickered open for a moment, just a crack. She leaned in closer. "You can rest," she said, her voice gentle. "I'll keep watch." But he shook his head, stubborn despite his injuries. He pointed to her stomach, then to the sky, and finally to the bundle she still carried with her, the wooden carving, the feather, the pouch of cedar. "You want him to be more than what they fear?" she asked, understanding his silent plea. "You want him to know?" He nodded weakly, and with the little strength he had left, he lifted his hand and placed it on her belly. Her eyes burned. No one had touched her like that in a long time, not since before they had labeled her a shame, a warning, a sin. She covered his hand with hers. "He'll have your strength," she said softly, "and my fire." Then, with his last remaining breath, he murmured 2 syllables. It wasn't in English, and it wasn't an apology. It was a name, his gift to the child. She repeated it aloud, unsure if she was pronouncing it correctly, but he smiled, small and pained, though his eyes sparkled with something deeper. Then he passed out, not in defeat, but as someone who had finally felt safe. That night, the stars returned, and she lay awake beside him, one hand resting on her belly, the other on the bundle. She whispered the name over and over, giving it life, giving it meaning. For the first time since she had been torn from the church steps, Anth didn't feel alone. She felt chosen, not by man, not by law, but by something older, something that had never needed words to say yes. 3 days passed before he was able to stand. His wound festered and then slowly healed, as stubborn as the land itself, unsure whether to let him survive or not. Anth cared for him with the calm of someone who had already lost everything and refused to lose again. She boiled roots and sang old hymns under her breath, whispering the name of the baby as though it were a blessing she could plant in the soil. He listened, his breath slow and steady, as the world around them continued to move. He always listened, and in the quiet moments between dawn and dusk, he began to teach. He showed her the distinction between leaves that could heal and those that could harm. He traced tribal constellations in the earth next to her, and carved a new figure from cedar. This time it was a small child positioned between two figures standing beneath the sun. She traced it with her fingers, saying softly, "That's us." He nodded, then pointed to the east. "Do you want to go back?" she asked. "To the town?" He didn't reply, just held her gaze. She understood what he meant without words. Not for vengeance, not for justice, but for the truth. For the child. That night she couldn't sleep. The thought of returning, stepping back into the place where her name had been stripped away, where shame was doled out like scripture, twisted her insides more than any pain the child inside her caused. But she knew what would happen if they didn't go. The town would tell its version of the story, and the child would grow up haunted by a shadow he couldn't understand. Worse, he'd grow up without the man who had already bled to protect him. At dawn, she tied her hair back and packed the little they had. He stood against the cedar tree, his face pale but steady. "Are you sure?" she asked. He raised his hand and touched the carving. That was his answer. They moved slowly, following ridge trails and creek beds, avoiding the open road. Her ankles swelled, his shoulder ached, but they moved together. When they reached the overlook above the town, Anth felt her legs tremble. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played between houses, and life continued as if the fire that nearly consumed her had gone unnoticed. "They won't welcome us," she said, "but they will see us." The man stood beside her, not hiding, not apologizing, just ready. This time she took his hand because now it wasn't about escape. It was about claiming a space that had once tried to erase them. No bell rang when they entered the town. No guns were drawn, no stones thrown. Only a silence that felt as sharp and brittle as the ground beneath their feet. Anth stepped back into the town that had dragged her from church and spit her name into the dirt, walking alongside the Lakota man they had feared without truly understanding him. Neither of them lowered their gaze. The baby inside her shifted, alive and attentive. They walked down the main street, past the blacksmith, the post office, and the saloon, where the sheriff leaned against the rail, his hat low. "Annbeth," he called softly. She stopped but didn't turn. "I don't want trouble," he added. "Then stop causing it," she replied. "We just came for the truth." "What truth?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. She turned to face him, her belly forward, her face set like stone. That this child was never a shame. That the man who fathered him didn't deserve to die nameless. That protection doesn't require a badge. The sheriff's gaze flicked toward the Lakota man, who stood unmoving, his wounded arm wrapped in cloth, his eyes unreadable. "He got you with child," the sheriff muttered before walking off. "He didn't," she said. "He sent his brother. The one who gave me his name. The one who stood when your whole church turned away." "You can't raise that boy here," the sheriff said. "There's no place." "Then we'll make one." Her voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "And if the world burns trying to stop us, let it burn." A door creaked open down the street. Mrs. Hensley, the seamstress, peered through a curtain. Another window shifted, and a man at the stables stepped forward, hat in hand. The town had come to see a spectacle, but instead, they saw a woman walking upright, pregnant, unashamed, beside a man who had given her silence instead of lies. The Lakota man stepped forward, pulling a wooden carving from the pouch at his side, the woman, the child, and the protector, and placed it on the sheriff's rail. "If you don't understand it," Anth said, "then you were never meant to." She took the man's hand again, and together they kept walking. Past the well, past the bakery, to the far edge of town. They weren't asking permission. They were naming the ground beneath their feet. With every step, they claimed it as their own, and when they reached the edge of the creek, where the town's fences stopped but the trees had not yet claimed, they settled. They had nothing. No land, no lumber. But Anth discovered stone, and the Lakota man found cedar. Together, they built more than just a shelter, it was a statement. He carved beams with symbols, ones she couldn't read but could feel deep in her soul: spirals, sunbursts, birds with wide wings. She planted herbs and stitched cloth from old feed sacks. At night, they slept by a fire, not one that protected them from danger, but one that simply warmed them. When the child arrived 2 weeks early, breech and screaming, it was as if the land itself was reborn. Blood spilled like a second birth, and Anth nearly didn't survive. Yet he never left her side. When the baby's strong cry finally pierced the air, he cradled the boy first, then placed him in her arms, whispering the name they had agreed upon. It was the name he had given before the bloodshed. "Twin," she whispered, understanding it now. "It means us," she added, touching her chest. Then his, then the child's. Word spread. Some came to stare, others brought bread or curiosity. One woman left a basket of knitted socks without saying a word. But no one came to tear her down. Not now. Not with the child in her arms and the fire in her eyes. One morning, Sheriff Markham stood near the tree line, a horse tied to a nearby branch. His face was older, wearier. "I'm not here to undo anything," he said. She replied simply, "Good, because you can't." He nodded toward the house. "He's yours and he's ours. You're not afraid anymore." She looked at her sleeping child beside the carvings on the wall, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the man splitting logs in the distance with his one good arm. Silence hung around them like armor. "No," she said. "I walked through fire. I named myself in front of men who thought I'd crawl. Fear's a luxury I burned." The sheriff didn't argue. He simply nodded once and rode away. That night, under the weight of stars thick with memory, the Lakota man carved one final beam above the door. His name, written just for her eyes. She traced it once, then kissed it, not out of ownership but out of truth. Spring arrived, and wildflowers bloomed where none had been planted. Anth knelt by the porch, Tawin bundled on her back, watching blue petals force their way up through the dry earth, a lesson meant only for her. The cabin stood strong now, the cedar beams weathered, the roof sealed with pine tar. The carving above the door remained untouched. The name he had left her that night never faded. Though she still couldn't pronounce it the way he did, it didn't matter. To the boy, he was Bowden, the name that stuck. Not Lakota, not English, just there's Bowden, a name born not from blood but from bond. Tahu visited once, bringing medicine, news from the northern hills. "They speak of her now," he told Bowden, nodding toward Anth, "the one who was dragged and then stood. They say her fire burned cleaner than their crosses." Anth smiled softly. "I didn't come to be remembered. I came to live." That night, as the fire crackled, Bowden carved tin, Anth dried sage into bundles to hang by the windows. "I still don't know what it says above the door," she murmured, glancing up at the beam. Bowden looked at her and then down, tapping his chest. "It means you stayed, doesn't it?" she guessed. He shook his head gently, reached over, and drew 2 simple shapes in the dirt, a hand and a flame. "You walked into it," she whispered. "You saw it all burning, and you took my hand anyway." He nodded, then drew a third symbol, a child between them beneath the fire. "We didn't survive the fire," she said quietly. We became it. Bowden smiled. That night, as smoke curled up through the rafters and owls called from the ridge, she lay beside him, whispering the names of things the world would never know. The river they loved, the star he called their guardian, the place where they buried the old life, with no headstones. In the morning, the boy would wake and run barefoot into the light. If you saw her take his hand in front of everyone who judged her, would you have done the same? Let us know in the comments.